My name's Anne Hardy and I'm an Associate Professor in the School of Social Sciences at the University of Tasmania. In my Study Australia Masterclass today, I'm going to be talking about how we can manage tourism for more sustainable outcomes. Sustainable tourism is the only way to protect the places we love most. What do we actually mean by it? Is it fact? Is it fashion? Is it fiction? How do we break it down? Where did it come from? And what are the innovations that are coming out of Australia that are leading the world in tourism research? Before we begin, I'd like to pay my respects to the Muwinina people, the traditional custodians of the land upon which we meet today. I'm joining you today from Tasmania, and the Muwinina people are some of the people who are recognised to have the longest continuing culture in the world. The Muwinina people had a strong connection to their land, sea, culture and water, and the way in which they treated Tasmania and the impacts that they have felt upon their community have a lot of synergies with what we're going to be talking about today. Because in the class today, we're really going to be focusing on how we can manage tourism so we minimise the impacts of tourism upon our land, our sea, our water and our culture. Where I'm coming from today is what I would regard as the perfect laboratory for studying tourism. Tasmania is a small island off the south end of Australia and it's about as large as Sri Lanka. But unlike Sri Lanka that has 21 million people living in it, we only have 500,000 people living here in Tasmania. And not only that, half of our island is actually protected as National Park or World Heritage Area. So with our little island with 500,000 people, we have 1.3 million tourists coming in each year. And it acts as like a fantastic little laboratory from which we can actually do our research and see the impacts of tourism. And at the University of Tasmania, our focus in tourism really sits around a couple of areas. One of the areas that we're really interested in is how we can use technology to understand what sustainable tourism is. And another thing that we're actually looking in is how we can actually protect communities. But before we go into that, I want to talk to you about what sustainable tourism is. Sustainable tourism is a concept that became really popular in the late 1990s, but it wasn't just suddenly defined and then burst onto the scenes and was taken up by tourism organisations. It was a concept that came out of a lot of different people thinking about how we needed to improve. So after the Second World War, there was discussion of how we needed to rejig our economies and how we had to also weigh that up with protecting the environment and also protecting the cultures of the people around the world. So we started to see people like academics such as Doxy talking about the fact that the impact of tourism on communities wouldn't always be seen in the same way. As more and more tourists came, then communities might not like it. We also began to see discussions by academics such as Butler, who talked about the fact that tourism didn't stay the same. It was always changing and there were always different impacts on communities and on cultures and also on the environment. And amongst all of that different discussion, we also started to see organisations such as the United Nations talking about the fact that we had to rethink the way in which we managed our environment. So all these things came together and it was like the perfect storm. And in the mid-1990s, we started to see the term sustainable tourism actually be defined. And from then it became really, really popular. So what does it actually mean? Sustainable tourism has been defined as a form of tourism that considers three things: protection of the environment, protection of communities and culture, and economic prosperity. But the fourth thing I like to add is the fact that it also considers visitors. Because if we don't have happy visitors and they're not coming back, then we don't actually have sustainable tourism. And it's kind of an inherently contradictory term, if you like, because sustainable means to keep and development, from which sustainable tourism came, means to change. So there's a lot of tension in this particular concept. So at the University of Tasmania, we do research that really tries to drill into these quite conflicting issues. And I'm going to talk to you about three innovations that have come out of our research into sustainable tourism. The first innovation that has come out of the University of Tasmania in terms of sustainable tourism is the use of technology to really understand what's happening in tourism and where the tourists are actually going. And we're starting to use it to try and change tourist behaviour. Because what we know is that if we can change tourist behaviour, we can actually divert them away from areas that might need protection in terms of the environment. We can ensure that they're not going to crowded places so they have more enjoyable experiences. And we can also ensure that they contribute more to communities. The innovation that we've designed is called Tourism Tracer. And Tourism Tracer is an app that we designed that tracks tourists as they move around destinations. But it's not just a tracking app. It's a tracking app that also has a survey within it, so we can actually sync the movement data, which we call the GIS data, with the survey data, so we know precisely where tourists are actually moving around our island. It sounds like a pretty ferocious thing to do because we all know that tracking is not a good thing if you don't have consent. So what we've done is get the consent of tourists as they arrive in Tasmania, and we actually ask them, can we follow where you go? Because if we can actually follow where you go, then we can actually help improve your experiences. So since around 2017 when we launched, we've been tracking tourists about 1,000 a year as they move around our state. It gives us details down to 10 metres of accuracy where tourists actually move around the state. It created so much excitement around the world that it was actually made a research partner of the United Nations World Tourism Organisation's Sustainable Tourism Division, and it's actually since been commercialised. So it was an exciting innovation to come out of the state. And the things that it showed us really made us rethink the way in which tourism works, and that made us rethink the way in terms of how we might manage tourism sustainably. One of the first things was it showed where people went, how many times they stopped per day, and how many kilometres they actually drove. So we could see precisely where different segments of tourists were travelling around our state. And we could also find out how they were walking through our national parks. We could find out how long they were standing on lookouts and looking at the view. We could see where they walked through the parks. We could even see where they didn't walk through the parks and sometimes where they went off track. And the significance of this relates right back to sustainable tourism. You'll remember I said that sustainable tourism is all about keeping visitors happy. One of them is that you need to keep them satisfied. So if you know how tourists are moving through your location, then you can actually offer products that actually suit the time and the needs that they have. So in the national park that I'm talking about, which is Freycinet National Park, we worked out that the tourists were standing on the lookout for about 13 minutes. So that gives us an insight. If we want to design interpretation to teach these tourists about the location that they're staying in, we need to make it really short and sharp so that they have time to have photos, be with their friends and family, but also read the information. And the other thing that information gave us was it allowed us to understand how the tourists were moving through the park. And to our surprise, we found many of them on tracks that we never expected before. So we could improve the tracks and make it safer for the tourists. And that improvement and the hardening of the tracks also ensured that the tourists going through the park weren't actually impacting upon the environment as much as they were before, because we could harden up the tracks and get the tourists moving in particular directions and away from endangered species and that type of thing. It also really gave us insights into how they moved around the state and between different destinations and also between different businesses. So by being able to share that information with the businesses and with the destinations, they can actually then improve and offer products that those specific segments of tourists need. The other exciting thing that came out of this research was that we were able to push the boundaries in terms of understanding how tourists actually disperse through locations and the impact that putting an airport in or having an airport in a specific place has upon their movement. We could also understand the factors that enhance dispersal. Again, the reason why that relates back to sustainability is what we don't want in sustainable tourism is large amounts of tourists congregating in the same region. So if you think back to your own experiences of tourists, when you've been, going to a location, what you don't want is stacks of other tourists around you jostling for space and to get a view and to get a good photo. So through this app, we can actually understand what the factors are that encourage people to disperse. And then if we know that it's their age, if it's where they come from, who they're travelling with, or the airport that they arrived at, we can actually then use that data to provide tourists with information and encourage them to go to other places. One of the other exciting things that has come out of this app is the fact that it tracks people in real time. So what we can actually do is see where tourists are. You might kind of think, well, that's a little bit like Big Brother, but if it's used well and anonymously, this data can be really, really important. And again, that comes back to that notion of over-tourism and crowding. So what we can do is that we know the hotspots of crowding around the state in Tasmania, and we can actually see tourists as they're driving towards those destinations. Now, if we know the type of tourist that's likely to stop in a crowded car park, we can actually send them a message through the app and offer them an alternative place to go, which is going to encourage dispersal, lessen the crowding, and give them a good experience. So at the moment, we're working on that app and the rollout of that to try and encourage people to behave in slightly different ways. The other exciting thing we're also doing is designing a game where tourists are actually encouraged to disperse into the regions. Again, that shares the money around, lessens the crowding, and can also lessen the environmental impacts in hotspot locations. So the second innovation that I'd like to talk to you about relates to how tourism impacts upon communities. You'll remember at the beginning of the masterclass I said that sustainable tourism, in its traditional definition, talked about three things that we have to consider. We have to consider the environment, we have to consider the economy, and we also have to consider communities. And quite often, when you hear people talking about sustainable tourism, you'll hear them referring to it as if it's about environmental protection. But what we realise here at the University of Tasmania and through the research that other Australian researchers are doing is that we really have to consider communities and cultures and how tourism impacts upon that. And in fact, they're actually completely interlinked. So we can't think of them in isolation, we have to think of them together. Typically in the past, when we've tried to understand the impacts that tourism has upon communities, we've tended to do things like surveys. We realise that we can't always rely on written surveys and internet research to actually get that, because many people struggle with reading, they're not connected to the methods where we're actually pushing out those surveys, and they don't realise that things are going on. So at the University of Tasmania, we've been doing some really interesting research over the last few years, using things like visual methodologies to try and get into the hearts and minds and understand what local people really think about tourism. So we've been doing something which is called Q-sort methodology. And what that is that we actually get a large amount of photographs and we gather them up, and they all have different photos of different possible scenarios of tourism on them. And we go out to the communities, we go to places like supermarkets, we go to the shopping centres, we go to the newsagents, to the sports halls, we go to the tourism operators, we go to the tourism events, and we ask them to sort those photos with the different tourism scenarios and tell us what they want. We've been able to use that approach to understand lots of different issues that are facing tourism right now. One of them in particular is the disruption that's come from the sharing economy. So what we all know in the last 15 years is that when we decide to be tourists, we act in a very different way. We used to go and find a travel agent, we used to read Lonely Planet guidebooks, and we'd make our bookings that way. But now we're going online, and that's led to the rise of platforms like Airbnb. So we've been asking some big questions. What are the impacts that Airbnb has upon our community? And it's allowed us to really understand how the changing nature of tourism is affecting our community. And with that information, we can then feed that straight into the government and to Destination Management Organisation. And that helps them with designing their management plans and also with their regulations. The research that we do at the University of Tasmania also allows us to understand the impact that tourism has on things like the achievement of social justice. And this research that we're doing is really drilling into the different elements of tourism and how it can actually enhance the plight of people such as minority groups and people who have traditionally not been involved in the tourism economy. And that's given us some really important insights into how we can improve tourism and how we can make it more sustainable. So an example of what we've been doing in recent years is that we've been looking at the impact that events have upon communities and how you can actually use events to support people and minority groups in particular. And in terms of sustainable tourism, we know that looking forward, if we want tourism to be able to contribute to the richness and the fabric of our society, then we really need to do things like hold events that are really, really different in terms of what they offer, because these different types of events bring new ideas into our community, and that in turn can enhance sustainability. So the third innovation that's come out of the research that we're doing into sustainable tourism relates to how tourists actually behave. Because if we know how tourists actually behave and how they form groups and interact and what stresses them out, what makes them anxious and what makes them happy, and if we're able to use that information to create more enjoyable experiences, then we can actually enhance sustainable tourism. Over the past few years, we've been doing some really interesting research looking at cross-cultural tourism behaviours. And in particular, we've been looking at what makes tourists anxious and what makes tourists happy. And we realised that those elements really change when you look at different types of tourists from different countries. Some of the research that we've been doing in this space has been conducted down at Port Arthur, which is a historic site in the southern end of Tasmania. And what we did was we talked to tourists who'd come to Tasmania from China, and we asked them what was it that really made them anxious when they were travelling. And we were able to discover things like planning or a lack of planning, food, money, and also English. The lack of understanding of English really made the tourists worry and anxious. And we were able to use that information, give it back to the Port Arthur Historic Site Management Authority, and they could actually use it to improve the experiences of the tourists. The other research that we've been doing has been looking at how tourists form groups when they travel. So many of you would have been away before, and on your travels you often meet other tourists. And sometimes when you meet them, you chat to them about your experiences. And that's what we're really interested in understanding so that we can try and improve the experiences of travellers. So where I'm sitting today is right on the waterfront. And right behind me, many days per year, a ship will come in and unload, and that ship has come from Antarctica. And we're really lucky at the University of Tasmania because we can do research on the Antarctic tourism experience, and that's where we've been really exploring this concept. So leveraging our connections to the Antarctic, we've been able to put our researchers on cruise ships, and they've been able to go down into the Antarctic over the summer and conduct their research on tourists. And through that research, we've been able to gain some really significant insights into how tourists behave. In particular, what we've been doing is using a theory and a construct called neo-tribal theory. Neo-tribal theory says that what happens in modern society is that we often come together and form groups. And these groups are really fluid groupings. They don't necessarily remain as permanent groups. They just reform, and then they disband, and then they come back together. Neo-tribal theory also says that these groupings are often formed by people who have something in common. They have a shared passion, they actually like to connect with each other, and the groupings actually have structures within them. So they actually have those people who are more experienced or less experienced. There might be leaders of the group, followers of the group, and people who are just transient members of the group. So we used this theory when we actually looked at how people behave down in the Antarctic, and we could see that the tourists do that actual neo-tribal behaviour. They come together, they share their experiences, and then they often go back to their rooms at night, the group disbands, and then they might reform the next day. So a good example of that are the bird watchers. When we went down on the tour, we could see that tourists were coming together, such as these birders. They would meet with each other, share their loves of birds, share tips with each other, and then when the tour ended, they'd often keep in touch with each other. They'd go back to their homes and then they'd actually share and reflect. You might ask yourself, well, what has that got to do with sustainable tourism? But what we can know is that if these groups of people come together, we can actually provide marketing to them later on. They become our brand ambassadors. We know that these tourists might keep in contact with each other and share their experiences. And they might also tell their friends and family about the experiences that they've had. So we can help them sell our products. But in addition to that, the tourism operators, through the knowledge that we've been able to give them, can actually use the knowledge of the different tribes that form during their tour, and they can use that to actually enhance the bonding between the tourists. And what that does is provide them with a really, really rich experience. We now know that on a tour, it's not just enough to provide a product. We actually have to provide a really memorable experience. So if you're able to identify the tribes that actually form on these long cruises that take place down in the Antarctic, you can cater to their needs. You can actually enhance them coming together and you can give them a better experience. In addition to that, what we're also working on at the moment is understanding the role that citizen social science plays in tourism and also beyond. The impacts of tourism upon the environment, and particularly climate change, are right at the forefront of what's happening down in Antarctica at the moment. And many of the tourism operators are working really hard to try and understand not only how climate change is going to impact their business, but also get tourists involved in understanding how climate change is actually affecting the environment down in the Antarctic. So at the moment we're working with researchers and also with tourism organisations down there, and in particular cruise ship companies, and we're looking at the role of social science. We're looking at not just about the data that is actually collected, but also the role that that plays in terms of the tourist experience. So there's basically 3 innovations that we've covered today. Innovations related to the use of technology to understand tourist behaviour, innovations related to the impacts that tourism has on communities, and also innovations that relate to how we understand tourists and how they behave. Sustainable tourism is a concept that came around in the early 1990s and it became really, really popular in the late 90s and early 2000. But COVID has changed everything for us. And it's even changed the way in which we think about sustainable tourism. People recently have been arguing that that notion of maintaining and sustaining is not enough. Tourism has to be an economic sector that actually makes tangible contributions to our environment, to our communities, and also to our economies. So in recent years, we've seen calls for things like regenerative tourism, which is a concept that actually pushes sustainable tourism further. That concept argues that we need to add more things and that we have to ensure that we have flourishing communities within which sustainable tourism operates. Australia is regarded as a leader in its field in sustainable tourism, and there are many organisations around the country, particularly tertiary institutions and the universities, that are doing a lot of active research in this space. I hope that this masterclass has given you an insight into the concept, its importance, and what we're doing here at the University of Tasmania in this space. And in particular, I'm hopeful that it's given you a new lens through which you can see tourism. Thank you for joining me.